Welcome to the Wild West, Myths Busted. Today, we're exposing the biggest lies you've been told about cowboys, outlaws, and gunfights, and revealing what the Wild West was really like. There's a certain way a man looks at the horizon out here, a way he understands that the land remembers everything. It remembers the truth, even when stories and legends try to pave it over. We've all grown up with an idea of the Wild West, a picture painted in our minds by flickering movie screens and dog-eared paperbacks. A world of dusty streets, quick-draw duels at high noon, and men who lived and died by the iron they carried on their hip. It's a powerful story, one that speaks to something deep inside us about freedom and a certain kind of untamed justice. But a story, no matter how good it is, isn't always the truth. The land, it holds the real history. And the truth of the American West is a whole lot more complicated and maybe a whole lot more interesting than the legends we've been fed. A lot of what we think we know, what we take for granted as gospel about that time, well, it's just myth. It's a shadow puppet show against the wall. And the real events cast a very different silhouette. It's time we step out of the theater and into the sunlight. So today, we're going to take a hard look at that horizon. We're going to separate the man from the myth, the fact from the fiction. We're going to peel back the layers of Hollywood gloss and dime novel exaggeration to find the real, breathing heart of the Old West. We're talking about the Wild West myths versus reality, because a man owes it to himself and to the people who came before him to know the real story, to understand the ground he stands on. You close your eyes and picture a cowboy. What's the first thing you see? It's the hat, isn't it? A wide-brimmed Stetson, creased just so, casting a shadow over a steely-eyed gaze. It's as much a part of the uniform as the boots and the dust. It's the crown of the American West, the symbol of a rugged individual. The thing is, that picture, as iconic as it is mostly a mirage. A clever bit of marketing that came along much later. The truth is, the men who actually worked the cattle trails, the ones who spent months on end sleeping under the stars and eating dust, they were practical men. A man's gear had to work. It had to stand up to the sun, the rain, the wind, and the occasional stampede. And the hat that did the job best for most of them wasn't the one we see in the movies. It was something a lot less glamorous, but a hell of a lot more common. They wore what worked. For a lot of them, that meant a bowler hat. You heard me. The same kind of rounded, hard felt hat you'd see on a banker in New York City or a shopkeep in London. They called them derbies over here. They were tough. They stayed on your head in the wind better than a big floppy brim. And if you got into a scrap, they offered a bit of protection. They were the hard hats of their day. Look at the old photographs. Not the posed studio portraits, but the candid shots of men on the trail, in the saloons, standing by their horses. You'll see bowlers everywhere. They were the most popular hat in the American West for a good long while. Men like Bat Masterson, Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, they were all photographed wearing bowler hats. It was the everyday headwear of the working man, cowboy included. The famous boss of the plains, the hat designed by John B. Stetson that would eventually evolve into the modern cowboy hat, didn't really take over until the tail end of the 19th century. It was a good hat, no doubt about it. It was durable, its wide brim was great for sun and rain. But it was also more expensive, and for many years, it was just one of many options available to a man trying to keep the sun out of his eyes. Other hats were common too. You'd see old Civil War kepis, slouch hats made of cheap wool, straw hats in the summer, and a whole variety of headwear brought over by immigrants from all corners of the world. The West was a melting pot, and the headwear reflected that. It wasn't a uniform. It was a collection of individual choices based on price, availability, and what a man needed to get the job done. The idea of the cowboy hat is really a 20th century invention. It was cemented in the American mind by rodeo stars like Tom Mix in the early 1900s, who took the Stetson and made it his signature. He was a showman, and he understood branding. He created an image, and Hollywood grabbed onto it with both hands and never let go. They needed a simple, powerful visual to define their hero. That wide-brimmed hat became a shorthand. It meant hero. It meant independence. It meant the West. It was an easy symbol for a complex reality. When you saw that hat, you knew who the good guy was supposed to be. It was a piece of costume that told the audience everything they needed to know before the character even said a word. It was storytelling, not history. But the man on the trail, the one moving a herd of longhorns from Texas to Kansas, he wasn't thinking about his brand. He was thinking about the weather. He was thinking about the river crossing up ahead. He was thinking about whether his hat would blow off in the next gust of wind and spook the cattle. His choice was about survival and function, not about looking the part for some future audience. So the next time you see a classic Western, and you see that lone rider silhouetted against the sunset, his perfect hat perched on his head, remember the truth. Remember the man in the dusty, dented bowler hat. He was the real deal. He might not look as romantic, but his story is the one that's written in the land itself, not just on a silver screen. The cowboy hat, as we know it, is a powerful piece of American iconography. There's no denying its place in our culture now. But its place in history is a different story. It's a reminder that sometimes the most enduring symbols are the ones that were manufactured long after the fact, created to sell a legend rather than reflect a reality. The real cowboy was too busy working to worry about his silhouette. There's a tension in the air. The dusty main street is empty. A tumbleweed blows past. Two men face each other, hands hovering over their holsters. The townspeople peek from behind curtains. It's high noon. This is the scene that defines the Wild West for so many. The quick-draw duel. The idea that every disagreement was settled with a flash of gunpowder and that every town was a battlefield where only the fastest guns survived. It makes for a great story. A man's worth measured in a fraction of a second. But like so many great stories, it's mostly smoke. The reality is, a stand-up, face-to-face gunfight in the middle of the street was incredibly rare. It was about as common as getting struck by lightning. Most cowboys and settlers went their entire lives without ever seeing one, let alone taking part in one. The reason is simple. People then, like people now, generally wanted to live to see another day. And walking into a gunfight is a damn poor way to ensure that. Even for a skilled gunman, there were no guarantees. A lucky shot, a ricochet, a moment's hesitation. It was a fool's game. Most violence, when it did happen, was a lot messier and a lot less honorable. It was ambushes, backshooting, or drunken brawls that got out of hand. Furthermore, the image of every man walking around armed to the teeth, ready to draw at a moment's notice, is just plain wrong. Many of the so-called wild towns of the West had stricter gun control laws than many modern American cities. When you rode into a town like Dodge City or Tombstone, one of the first things you'd see was a sign telling you to check your firearms. You were expected to deposit your guns with the sheriff or a designated hotel or saloon keeper. You get a token, a claim check for your weapon, and you'd pick it up on your way out of town. The townspeople, the merchants, the marshals, they didn't want a bunch of trail-weary cowboys flush with cash and whiskey shooting up the place. It was bad for business. It was bad for everyone. The purpose of these laws was to keep the peace. A town's survival depended on its reputation. If it was known as a place where you could get shot just for looking at someone the wrong way, people would stop coming. The cattle drives would find a different railhead. The merchants would pack up and leave. Order wasn't the enemy of the West. It was the foundation it was trying to build. Think about it from a practical standpoint. You're a lawman, a Wyatt Earp, or a Bat Masterson. Your job is to maintain order. The easiest way to do that is to take the guns out of the equation before trouble even starts. Disarming visitors was the most effective form of preventative law enforcement they had. It wasn't about infringing on rights. It was about ensuring public safety so the town could prosper. Of course, the laws weren't always followed. Outlaws and troublemakers would try to keep their guns, and that's often when the trouble would start. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral wasn't a classic high-noon duel. It was a confrontation that erupted in part because the Clanton and McLaury faction had failed to disarm themselves according to Tombstone's town ordinance. The Earps and Doc Holliday were, in essence, trying to enforce the local gun control law. The whole myth of the constant gunfight was largely a creation of the dime novels of the era. Writers back east, who had often never been west of the Mississippi, needed to sell papers. They took small, isolated incidents and blew them up into epic battles. They turned lawmen into superheroes and outlaws into romantic anti-heroes. And they put a gun in everyone's hand because it sold copies. Hollywood then took that dime novel fantasy and ran with it for a century. The gunfight became the central plot device of the Western genre. It was a simple, dramatic way to resolve conflict. It was visual, it was exciting, and it fit neatly into a 90-minute movie. But it was drama, not documentary. It was a narrative choice that sacrificed historical accuracy for cinematic tension. The real West was a place of hard work, not constant conflict. The soundtrack of a cattle town was more likely the lowing of cattle and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer than the roar of six-shooters. The real dangers weren't gunfighters, but disease, accidents, and the unforgiving elements. A man was far more likely to die from being thrown from a horse or from cholera than from a bullet in a duel. The story they sell you is one of chaos. A land without rules, where a man was his own law and the only justice came from the barrel of a gun. They call it the Wild West for a reason, right? It's a powerful image, this idea of a lawless frontier. It speaks to a desire for ultimate freedom, for a place beyond the reach of governments and civilization. But the truth is, civilization and the law got there a lot faster than the legends let on. Most of those dusty western towns were, by and large, orderly places. In fact, historical records show that places like Dodge City, Tombstone, and Deadwood had lower homicide rates than many major cities back east at the time. The Wild West was, in many ways, safer than the civilized East. It's a hard thing to wrap your head around, given everything we've been shown. The reason for this relative peace was the swift and certain presence of the law. As soon as a settlement grew beyond a few shacks, the first thing the citizens did was establish some form of government. They elected a mayor, a town council, and most importantly, they hired a marshal or a sheriff. These weren't just guys with a tin star and a quick trigger finger. They were professional peacekeepers. Their job wasn't to get into shootouts. Their job was to prevent them. They were there to handle the day-to-day business of a town, breaking up fights, arresting drunks, investigating thefts, and yes, enforcing those gun ordinances we talked about. They were often supported by deputies, and in the territories they could call on U.S. Marshals for federal matters. There was a structure, there was a system, and the justice they dealt was often swift. There were courts and judges, even in the most remote areas. Circuit judges would travel from town to town to hear cases, while a frontier court might have been less formal than one in Boston. It still operated on principles of evidence and law. A man couldn't just get away with murder because he was fast on the draw. He'd be hunted, arrested, tried, and, if found guilty, hanged. The idea of a lawless land also ignores the powerful social forces at play. Reputation was everything. In a small community where everyone knew everyone else, social pressure was a potent tool for keeping people in line. A man known as a troublemaker would find himself unwelcome. He wouldn't be able to get credit at the general store, a drink at the saloon, or a job on a ranch. Ostracism was a powerful deterrent. The great cattle drives, often portrayed as anarchic journeys, were also highly structured. The trail boss was the absolute authority. His word was law. He was responsible for the herd, the men, and the payroll. He had to maintain discipline over dozens of men for months at a time. There were rules for everything, from who stood watch at night to how disputes were to be settled. It was a mobile, self-regulating society. Of course, there were pockets of lawlessness. Remote areas, far from the reach of the nearest sheriff, could be dangerous. And there were periods of chaos, like during gold rushes, when a sudden influx of thousands of people could overwhelm the nascent legal structures. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. The goal was always to establish order as quickly as possible because order meant stability, and stability meant prosperity. The myth of the lawless West serves a narrative purpose. It creates a blank slate upon which a hero can write his own rules. It provides the necessary chaos for the lone man of principle to bring order. It's a classic story structure, but it fundamentally misunderstands the priorities of the people who actually lived there. They weren't seeking anarchy. They were trying to build a new society. They were building towns, ranches, and farms. They were raising families. They were investing their lives and their fortunes in this new land. The last thing they wanted was for it all to be threatened by constant violence and chaos. They craved law and order just as much, if not more, than the people they'd left behind back east. They were building a civilization, not running from it. So when you think of the West, don't just picture the outlaw on the run. Picture the town council meeting. Picture the sheriff making his rounds. Picture the circuit judge hearing a case about a stolen horse. Picture the citizens working together to build a schoolhouse. That was the reality for most people. The West wasn't wild because it was lawless. It was wild because of the land itself, the vast, untamed, and beautiful landscape where they were struggling to plant the seeds of order. The story is always the same. The wagon train circled for the night, the lonely cabin on the prairie, and then the sound of war cries. the sky filled with arrows. It's the settlers versus the savages, a relentless, unavoidable conflict for the soul of the continent. This is perhaps the most damaging myth of them all, the one that paints the relationship between settlers and Native Americans with a single bloody brushstroke. It's a simple story, and like all simple stories, it leaves out the most important parts. The truth is, the history of interaction between settlers and the dozens of diverse Native American tribes is not one of constant warfare. For long periods, in many places, the relationship was one of coexistence, of trade, and sometimes even of mutual dependence. It was a complex human story, not a simple battle of good versus evil. Many tribes actively engaged in trade with the settlers. They had been trading with each other for centuries, and the arrival of newcomers simply opened up new markets. They traded furs, hides, horses, and food for things they couldn't produce themselves. Metal goods like pots and knives, firearms, textiles, and coffee. This trade was a vital part of the Western economy for decades. Settlers often relied on the knowledge and guidance of local tribes to survive. Native Americans taught them which plants were edible, how to track game, and the best routes through unfamiliar territory. They understood the land in a way the newcomers did not. In many early settlements, the survival of the pioneers was directly linked to the help they received from their native neighbors. This wasn't always a happy, utopian relationship, of course. There were cultural misunderstandings, there was mistrust, there was competition for resources, especially as the number of settlers grew. But the automatic response wasn't always violence. Diplomacy, negotiation, and treaties were common. Both sides, in many cases, tried to find ways to live with each other because peace was more profitable and safer than war. The relentless warfare we see in the movies largely ignores the timeline. The most intense periods of conflict, the so-called Indian Wars, happened in specific regions and at specific times, often as a direct result of broken treaties and the massive government-sponsored push for expansion. It wasn't a constant continent-wide state of affairs from the moment the first wagon went west. The myth of the savage Indian was also a useful piece of propaganda. It was easier to justify taking land, to justify breaking treaties, to justify violence, if the people you were displacing were portrayed as inhuman, bloodthirsty aggressors. It dehumanized an entire population, lumping hundreds of distinct cultures and nations into a single monstrous caricature. It was a story told to make the conqueror feel righteous. Hollywood, again, is a primary culprit in cementing this myth. For decades, Native Americans were portrayed as one-dimensional villains. They were the faceless horde that attacked the heroes, their motivations rarely explored beyond a simplistic desire for violence. They were a plot device, a natural obstacle like a storm or a mountain pass, rather than a people with their own history, culture, and perspective. It's also crucial to remember that there was no single Native American response. The tribes were not a monolith. The Lakota Sioux had a different relationship with settlers than the Navajo, who had a different one from the Cherokee or the Nez Perce. Some tribes fought fiercely to defend their land. Others chose paths of accommodation or alliance. Many were caught in between, trying to navigate a world that was changing with terrifying speed. The real story includes figures like Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, a man who sought peace until he was forced into one of the most remarkable and tragic military retreats in American history. It includes the 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, who adopted American-style governments and farming techniques, only to be forcibly removed on the Trail of Tears. It's a story of diplomacy, betrayal, resilience, and immense tragedy. To paint it all as one long war is to do a disservice to everyone involved. It erases the moments of peace, the instances of cooperation, and the complex human relationships that formed on the frontier. The real history is messier, but it's also more truthful. It acknowledges that the West was a shared space, and the story of that sharing is one of conflict, yes, but also of connection, trade, and a long, complicated dance between cultures. His name is whispered in saloons and around campfires. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, they are the rock stars of the Old West. Robin Hoods on horseback, robbing from the rich and thumbing their noses at authority. They ride free, live by their own code, and their legend is bigger than the law itself. They are the outlaws, and in the myth of the West, they rule the land. This is the romantic heart of the Western legend. The appeal of the outlaw is the appeal of pure rebellion. But the truth about these men, and the prevalence of outlaws in general, is a lot smaller and a lot grubbier than the legend would have you believe. The idea that vast swaths of the West were controlled by powerful outlaw gangs is another tall tale. For one thing, being a full-time outlaw was an incredibly difficult and often short-lived career. It wasn't a life of glamour and freedom. It was a life of constantly looking over your shoulder. It meant sleeping in cold, rocky hideouts, eating poorly, and trusting no one. Most gangs were small, disorganized, and fell apart after just a few robberies. The big scores you see in the movies, the massive train robberies and bank heists, were exceptionally rare and difficult to pull off. More often, outlaws were petty criminals. They were horse thieves, cattle rustlers, or small-time crooks who would rob a lonely stagecoach for a few $100s, which then had to be split among the whole gang. It was a hard way to make a dishonest living. The land itself was their biggest enemy. The same vast, empty spaces that seemed to promise freedom also made it incredibly difficult to escape. A posse could track a gang for days across the open plains or through the mountains. There were few places to hide and even fewer places to spend your stolen money without drawing attention. A stranger riding into town with a pockets full of cash was an immediate source of suspicion, and the public was not on their side. The idea of the outlaw as a Robin Hood figure, beloved by the common folk, is almost entirely fiction. People hated them, the ranchers whose cattle were rustled, the banks that held the town's savings, the train passengers who were terrorized and robbed. These were not fans. They were victims. They actively helped the law, forming posses and providing information to bring the outlaws to justice. The famous outlaws we remember are famous precisely because they were the exception, not the rule. Jesse James became a legend partly because of a sympathetic newspaper editor who crafted a pro-Confederate Robin Hood narrative around him after the Civil War. It was political myth-making. Billy the Kid was a young, violent punk involved in a bloody New Mexico land war, not a charming rogue. His legend grew exponentially after his death. Their success was often wildly exaggerated. The Wild Bunch, led by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, was probably the most successful outlaw gang of the era. But their run of success lasted only a few years before the relentless pressure from law enforcement and Pinkerton detectives forced them to flee the country. They didn't rule the land. They were hounded out of it. The reality is that law enforcement, from local sheriffs to federal marshals and private agencies like the Pinkertons, was far more effective than the myths suggest. They were relentless. They used telegraphs to spread information, developed networks of informants, and were incredibly persistent in hunting their quarry. The odds were stacked heavily against the outlaws. The outlaw myth persists because it's a story about the individual against the system. It's about freedom from rules. It's a fantasy. But the reality was that the system was winning. The West was being tamed, fenced in, and civilized. The outlaw wasn't a symbol of the West's wild spirit. He was a relic of a chaotic past that was rapidly disappearing. So, while their names are written large in the book of Western legends, their actual impact on the day-to-day life of the West was minimal. They were a nuisance, a danger, but they were not rulers. They were desperate men on the run, their shadows long in the setting sun, but the land they crossed was already moving on without them, building a future that had no place for them. So we look back at that horizon and the picture looks a little different now, doesn't it? The hats are different, the streets are quieter, and the lines between hero and villain, between wildness and order, are a lot more blurred. The real American West wasn't a movie set. It was a place of immense complexity, a place of hard work, compromise, and a constant, grinding effort to build something new out of a vast and unforgiving landscape. It was far richer and more human than the simple, dramatic myths Hollywood has sold us. The stories we tell about our past matter. They shape how we see ourselves, how we understand our country. The myth of the Wild West is a powerful one, but it's a story that leaves too many people out and smooths over too many complicated truths. It turns history into a simple morality play, and history is never that simple. The real story, the one written in the dust and the soil, is always more challenging and ultimately more rewarding. So I encourage you to keep questioning. Dig deeper than the legends. Read the letters written by the women on the prairie. Look at the faded photographs of the men in their bowler hats, and learn the real names and histories of the native tribes who called that land home for centuries. Question what you think you know, not just about the West, but about all of history. Because the truth, like the land itself, is always there. You just have to be willing to look for it. You have to be willing to listen to what it remembers.